Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When I hit rock bottom after my divorce, I thought my parents would have my back. Instead, they turned me away without a second thought, only to buy my brother a vacation home months later. Now, they're wondering why I don't call anymore. But the truth? It's much messier than they realize. When my marriage fell apart 3 years ago, I thought I'd hit rock bottom. My ex and I had been together for a decade, and while we'd had our fair share of ups and downs, I never expected him to end things so abruptly. One day, out of the blue, he came home from work, sat me down, and said, "I don't think this is working anymore." I stared at him, stunned, searching his face for any sign that he might be joking. But there was none. By the end of the week, he had moved out, leaving me alone in the house we'd built together. I spent those first few weeks in a haze, trying to process how 10 years of love, compromise, and dreams could fall apart so quickly. The legal process only made it worse. Untangling our lives was a nightmare. The house was put on the market, our joint bank accounts were drained to cover lawyers and fees, and even trivial things like who got the couch became a point of contention. By the time the papers were signed, I was left with barely enough money to scrape by, a mountain of debt, and a heart that felt like it had been run through a shredder. Desperate for stability, I turned to my parents for help. They'd always said, family comes first, and growing up, I believed that. I thought they'd step in without hesitation, offering me a lifeline while I figured out how to get back on my feet. When I called my mom to explain the situation, my voice cracked as I asked for a small loan, just enough to cover a couple of months' rent while I looked for a new job. I wasn't asking for a handout, just a little help to get through this rough patch. Her response floored me. "We can't afford to help you right now," she said, her tone sharp and dismissive. "You'll have to figure it out on your own." I blinked back tears, struggling to find words. "Mom, I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't important. I just need a little time to get back on my feet." She sighed, her voice dripping with disapproval. "Maybe if you'd been better with your finances, you wouldn't be in this mess. You're an adult. You should be able to handle this on your own." I hung up the phone feeling more alone than ever. My parents, the people I thought I could always count on, had shut me down without a second thought. They didn't ask how I was holding up or if I needed emotional support. To them, it seemed like I was just another problem they didn't want to deal with. With no safety net, I had to figure things out on my own. I found a small, rundown apartment on the edge of town that I could barely afford and started taking on freelance gigs while applying for full-time work. Every day felt like a battle just to keep the lights on and food in the fridge. Through it all, I kept telling myself that things would get better. But deep down, I couldn't shake the sting of my parents' rejection. They'd always been there for my brother, Ryan, whenever he needed help. Why was it different for me? I pushed those thoughts aside, telling myself I didn't have the luxury of dwelling on what I couldn't change. My focus had to be on surviving. But as the weeks turned into months, that question lingered in the back of my mind, planting the first seeds of resentment. Little did I know, those seeds were about to grow into something much bigger. The first night in my new apartment, I sat on the floor with a box of takeout, surrounded by unpacked boxes and mismatched furniture. The place was tiny, with creaky floors and an old radiator that made unsettling noises at random intervals. The kitchen was so small that I could stand in one spot and reach every cabinet, and the single window in the living room faced an alley that was perpetually in shadow. But it was mine, or at least as much as something could belong to you when you were barely scraping together rent. I threw myself into finding work, taking on freelance gigs that barely paid minimum wage while applying for full-time jobs in my field. I spent hours each day tweaking my resume, sending out applications, and networking wherever I could. It was exhausting, and there were days when the rejection emails felt like punches to the gut. Still, I managed to keep the lights on and food in the fridge, even if food sometimes meant instant ramen or canned soup. It wasn't the life I'd envisioned for myself, but I told myself it was temporary. I just had to hold on until something better came along. Every time I talked to my parents during this period, it was like they were reading from a script designed to make me feel worse. My mom's calls always started the same way, with her asking pointed questions that sounded more like accusations. "What exactly did you do to make him leave?" she asked during one particularly brutal conversation. The words stung, but I kept my voice steady. "Mom, it wasn't like that. Sometimes people just grow apart." She sighed heavily, as if I were an unruly teenager who couldn't get her act together. "You must have done something," she pressed. "Men don't just walk out for no reason." On other days, my dad would chime in with his version of tough love. "You've got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps," he said during one call. Nobody's going to fix this for you. I know, Dad, I replied, biting back the urge to remind him that I hadn't asked for anyone to fix it. I'd asked for a little help, and they'd turned me away. It became clear that they didn't want to understand what I was going through. To them, my divorce wasn't just a failure. It was a reflection of my character, a sign that I hadn't worked hard enough or been good enough to keep my marriage together. The moment that shattered any illusions I still had about their support came a few months later, when a cousin casually mentioned at a family gathering that my parents had bought my brother, Ryan, a new car. I froze, the words not quite registering at first. Wait, I said, trying to keep my tone even. They bought him a car? Yeah, my cousin said, shrugging like it was no big deal. He's been talking about it all week. It's one of those hybrids, really nice. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My brother, who already had a stable job, a nice apartment, and no financial struggles to speak of, was being gifted a brand new car, while I was rationing groceries and living paycheck to paycheck. Later that night, I called my mom to confirm what I'd heard. Oh, yes, she said, her tone light and cheerful. Your dad and I thought it would be a nice gesture. Ryan works so hard, and he's been so good about saving his money. I bit back the urge to scream. So, you could afford to buy Ryan a car, but you couldn't help me with a few months' rent when I was desperate? There was a pause, just long enough to let me know she wasn't expecting the question. Those are two different things, she said finally. You needed help because you weren't managing your finances well. Ryan earned this. I hung up the phone not long after, unable to stomach the conversation any longer. That night, as I lay in my creaky bed staring at the cracked ceiling, I felt something shift inside me. It was the first time I started to feel a crack in my relationship with my parents, a tiny fissure that would only grow wider with time. For the moment, I brushed it off. I had bigger problems to deal with, like finding a better job and pulling myself out of this financial hole. But somewhere in the back of my mind, the resentment had already started to take root. A year after my divorce, life was finally starting to feel manageable again. I'd landed a full-time job at a mid-sized marketing agency, and while it wasn't my dream role, it offered stability and a steady paycheck. I'd moved out of my dingy apartment and into a slightly better one, a place with decent lighting and enough space for a small dining table. I'd even started dating again, cautiously dipping my toes back into the world of relationships. My social life wasn't exactly thriving, but I was slowly rebuilding the confidence that had been shattered by my ex-husband's departure. Things were tight financially, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't constantly worried about making ends meet. So when my parents invited me over for a family dinner, I decided to go. Despite the lingering resentment from their lack of support during my divorce, I told myself that maintaining some kind of relationship was important. After all, they were still my parents, and maybe, just maybe, things could get better between us. The evening started out unremarkably. My mom fussed over the roast she'd made, my dad talked about the neighbor's new car, and Ryan showed up late, as usual, with his signature grin and effortless charm. We made small talk over dinner, and for a brief moment it felt like old times, like we were a normal, happy family. Then came the bombshell. So, my mom said, setting down her wine glass and smiling broadly, your dad and I have some exciting news to share. I glanced up, curious. My parents weren't exactly the big news type, so whatever they were about to say had to be significant. We just bought a vacation home, she announced, her smile widening. It's up in the mountains, a beautiful little place with stunning views. We're so excited for Ryan to have a place where he can relax after all his hard work. The words hung in the air like a slap. I sat there, gripping my fork so tightly I thought it might snap in half. My parents had just bought Ryan a vacation home, a luxury property, while I had spent the past year clawing my way out of financial ruin without a shred of help from them. I forced myself to swallow the lump in my throat. You bought Ryan a house? I asked, my voice carefully neutral. Oh, it's just a small vacation property, my mom said breezily, as if that made it better. Nothing too extravagant. But he worked so hard, and we thought he deserved a little getaway spot. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The same parents who had refused to lend me a dime when I was desperate for help were now spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a second home for Ryan, a man who already had a great job, a stable life, and no financial struggles to speak of. That's generous, I managed to say, though my voice wavered. Ryan grinned, clearly enjoying the spotlight. It's awesome, he said. I can't wait to go up there on weekends. There's even a hot tub on the deck. I sat in stunned silence for the rest of the meal, barely touching my food. My parents continued to gush about the vacation home, describing the cozy fireplace, the nearby hiking trails, and the serene mountain views. Meanwhile, all I could think about was the night I had begged my mom for help with rent, only to be told to figure it out. After dinner, As my mom served dessert, she turned to me with a smile. "You should come visit the house sometime," she said. "It's such a relaxing place. You'll love it." I nearly laughed out loud at the absurdity of her offer. The disconnect between their actions and their expectations was staggering. Did they really think I'd be excited to visit the house they'd bought for my brother while I'd been left to fend for myself? When I got home that night, I sat on my couch in the dark, replaying the evening in my mind. The anger and hurt I'd tried to suppress at dinner bubbled to the surface, overwhelming me. This wasn't just about the house. It was about everything. Their favoritism, their dismissal of my struggles, and their inability to see how their actions affected me. For years, I tried to convince myself that my parents loved Ryan and me equally, that their decisions weren't about favoritism, but about circumstance. But the vacation home was proof that I couldn't ignore. They didn't just prioritize Ryan. They celebrated him, rewarded him, while I was left to pick up the pieces of my life on my own. I didn't know what to do with the feelings of betrayal that consumed me that night. All I knew was that something had shifted between me and my parents, and there was no going back to the way things were before. After dinner, as Ryan and my dad moved to the living room to watch the game, I followed my mom into the kitchen. She was humming to herself as she loaded plates into the dishwasher, seemingly oblivious to the emotional bombshell she'd just dropped. "Mom," I began, trying to keep my tone calm, "can we talk for a minute?" She glanced at me over her shoulder. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" I hesitated for a moment, choosing my words carefully. "How could you do this?" I finally asked. "You wouldn't help me when I needed you the most, but you're buying Ryan a house?" Her face fell for a split second before she quickly composed herself. "It's not a house. It's a vacation property," she corrected, as if that made it better. "And it's not like we're handing it to him for free. We thought it was a good investment, and Ryan's worked so hard. He deserves something nice." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Deserves something nice?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Mom, I was drowning. I begged you for help, and you told me to figure it out on my own. How can you justify this?" She sighed, setting down the plate she was holding and turning to face me. "It's not the same thing," she said firmly. "You were going through a rough patch, but Ryan's been consistent. He's worked hard, saved his money, and built a stable life. This is our way of rewarding him for that." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Consistent?" I snapped. "Ryan doesn't even need the help. He's already doing fine on his own, Mom. I needed you, and you turned your back on me. How can you not see how unfair this is?" She shook her head, her expression a mixture of frustration and exasperation. "Life isn't about being fair," she said dismissively. "You can't compare your situation to Ryan's. You're two different people with different challenges." Her refusal to acknowledge my feelings made my blood boil. "This isn't about comparing myself to Ryan," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "This is about the fact that when I was at my lowest, you decided I wasn't worth helping. And now you're bending over backward to give Ryan something he doesn't even need. Maybe if you'd made better choices, you wouldn't have been in that position," she shot back. I stared at her, stunned. "Better choices?" I repeated. "I was blindsided by a divorce after 10 years of marriage. How is that my fault?" "I'm not saying it's your fault," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But you can't expect us to bail you out every time something goes wrong. You're an adult. You need to learn to take responsibility for your own life." Her words were like pouring salt on an open wound. "I didn't ask you to bail me out," I said through gritted teeth. "I asked for help alone, not a handout. And you said no. Meanwhile, Ryan gets handed a vacation home because he's so consistent? Do you even hear how ridiculous that sounds?" She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "Ryan earned this, and you need to stop comparing yourself to him. We're proud of both of you in different ways, but this isn't about you." That was the moment I realized I wasn't going to get through to her. She didn't see the situation the way I did, and no amount of arguing was going to change that. "You know what?" I said, my voice trembling. "I don't think you'll ever understand how much this hurts. But I hope someday you'll look back and realize how unfair you've been." She didn't reply, just turned back to the sink and resumed washing dishes as if our conversation had never happened. I left the kitchen feeling angrier and more hurt than I had in years. Ryan and my dad were laughing about something in the living room, completely oblivious to the tension simmering in the next room. I grabbed my coat and left without saying goodbye. On the drive home, the events of the evening played over and over in my mind. My mom's words echoed like a broken record. "Life isn't about being fair. Ryan earned this. You need to stop comparing yourself to him." For years, I tried to convince myself that my parents loved Ryan and me equally, that their choices weren't about favoritism, but about circumstance. But tonight had shattered that illusion. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the truth was clear. They had chosen him over me, and they didn't even feel bad about it. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The anger I felt was no longer just a passing emotion. It was a seed of something bigger. A part of me wanted to cut ties completely, to walk away from my family and never look back. But another part of me, the part that still longed for their approval, held on to the hope that things might change. I didn't know what to do next, but one thing was certain. My relationship with my parents would never be the same again. The conversation with my mom replayed in my mind over and over for weeks. No matter how much I tried to distract myself, her words lingered like a bad taste I couldn't get rid of. Life isn't about being fair. Ryan earned this. Every time I thought about it, the anger and hurt flared up all over again. I stopped calling my parents as often, and when they called me, I kept the conversations short and polite, steering clear of anything personal. I couldn't bring myself to bring up the vacation home with my dad. I already knew what he would say. He'd brush it off, justify it, or worse, tell me to stop being jealous. In their eyes, Ryan was the golden child. He could do no wrong, and everything he accomplished was treated like it deserved a parade. Meanwhile, I felt like the family disappointment, the one who couldn't even keep her marriage together. I'd always suspected they saw me that way, but the vacation home made it glaringly obvious. Things only got worse when Ryan started posting photos of his new vacation home all over social media. It seemed like every other day there was a new post. Pictures of cozy fireplaces, sprawling mountain views, and sleek, expensive renovations. One post showed him lounging in a brand new hot tub on the deck, a glass of wine in hand, with the caption, "Living the dream." Every photo felt like a slap in the face. While I'd been rationing groceries and living paycheck to paycheck, my brother had been handed a luxury getaway that he didn't even need. It wasn't just the photos themselves, it was the comments. Friends and extended family gushed over Ryan's success, praising him for his hard work and marveling at the house. "Your parents must be so proud of you," one comment read, and I couldn't help but scoff. Proud of what? Accepting a handout? I tried to ignore the posts, but they were impossible to escape. Even when I muted Ryan's account, I'd still hear about the vacation home through the family grapevine. "Did you see the new furniture Ryan picked out?" my aunt asked during a family call. "That boy has such good taste." I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to say what I was really thinking. The growing distance between me and my parents didn't go unnoticed by my friends. Over drinks one night, my best friend, Sarah, asked me point blank what was going on. "You've been acting different lately," she said, eyeing me with concern. "You barely talk about your family anymore. Did something happen?" I hesitated, unsure how much to share. Part of me felt embarrassed to admit how deeply the situation was affecting me, but another part of me was desperate to let it out. "It's just complicated," I said finally, swirling the ice in my drink. "Let's just say my parents have made it pretty clear where their priorities lie, and it's not with me." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath and told her everything. The vacation home, my parents' refusal to help me after my divorce, and the way they constantly put Ryan on a pedestal. By the time I finished, Sarah looked as outraged as I felt. "That's insane," she said, shaking her head. "You have every right to be upset. Honestly, I don't know how you're still speaking to them." Her words gave me a strange sense of validation. For so long, I'd felt like I was overreacting, like I was being petty for feeling hurt. But hearing someone else confirm that my feelings were valid made me realize just how much I'd been holding in. Still, I couldn't bring myself to completely cut ties with my parents. Despite everything, I wanted to believe that our relationship could be salvaged, that they might one day see how unfair they'd been. But as time went on, my resentment only grew. Every call from my mom felt like a reminder of the gulf between us. She'd chat about Ryan's latest achievements or the renovations at the vacation home, oblivious to how it made me feel. When she asked about my life, her tone always seemed perfunctory, as if she was going through the motions of being a supportive parent without actually listening. At work, I threw myself into my job, hoping that if I focused on building my own success, it would dull the sting of my parents' favoritism. But no matter how well I did, it never felt like enough. I wasn't looking for their approval anymore. I'd given up on that, but the weight of their indifference was hard to shake. Inside, I was seething. I felt like I was carrying around a ball of anger that I couldn't put down. It wasn't just about the vacation home or the financial help I never got. It was about the years of feeling like I didn't measure up, the constant comparisons to Ryan, and the realization that my parents would never see me the way they saw him. I didn't know what to do with all that anger, so I kept it bottled up, pretending everything was fine. But deep down, I knew the facade wouldn't hold forever. Something had to give. I'd been dreading the family Christmas dinner for weeks. Every year, my parents hosted a lavish gathering with all the trimmings, twinkling lights, a towering tree, and a feast that could feed an army. But this year, the thought of sitting across the table from Ryan, hearing him gush about his vacation home while my parents beamed with pride, made my stomach churn. Still, I decided to go. Part of me wanted to avoid the inevitable drama, but another part of me felt obligated to keep the peace. Maybe if I stayed quiet, played nice, and got through the evening without incident, things wouldn't spiral out of control. The night started off predictably. My mom buzzed around the kitchen, barking orders about appetizers and side dishes, while my dad kept busy carving the turkey. Ryan strolled in late, as usual, wearing an expensive sweater and that ever-present grin of his. He was a golden boy, and he knew it. Dinner began with the usual small talk, work updates, holiday plans, and my mom's enthusiastic rundown of her latest baking adventures. For a while, I managed to keep my simmering resentment in check. But then Ryan brought up the vacation house. So, he began, flashing that charming smile. I'm planning to install a hot tub on the deck next month. It's going to be amazing. Perfect for relaxing after a long day on the slopes. My mom's face lit up. Oh, that's such a great idea. Your father and I will have to come up and try it out once it's finished. Ryan nodded, grinning. Mom and Dad have been so generous. I honestly don't know what I'd do without them. And just like that, something inside me snapped. Must be nice, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Must be nice to have parents who actually help you when you need it. The room went silent. My dad paused mid-bite, glaring at me from across the table, while my mom's smile faltered. Ryan, oblivious to the tension, raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, his tone defensive. I turned to him, my voice steady but sharp. It means you get everything handed to you on a silver platter while the rest of us are left to fend for ourselves. I needed help after my divorce, just a little support to get back on my feet, and Mom and Dad told me to figure it out on my own. But you get a whole house handed to you. And now a hot tub? How is that fair? Ryan's face darkened. Are you serious right now? He shot back. I didn't ask for any of this. Mom and Dad wanted to help me because I've worked hard for it. If you're upset, maybe you should take a look at your own life instead of blaming everyone else. That hit a nerve. Worked hard, I repeated, my voice rising. You've had everything handed to you since day one, Ryan. The car, the house, the constant praise, everything. Meanwhile, I've had to claw my way out of rock bottom with no help from anyone. But sure, let's talk about how hard you've worked. My dad slammed his fork down, his voice booming. That's enough, he barked. We're not doing this tonight. I turned to him, my anger boiling over. No, Dad. We're doing this. Because I'm done pretending like everything's fine. You've treated Ryan like he's the second coming while I've been left to struggle on my own. And now you're surprised that I'm upset? Give me a break. My mom tried to step in, her voice shaky. Sweetheart, that's not fair. We love you just as much as we love Ryan. Do you? I shot back, my voice trembling with emotion. Because it sure doesn't feel that way. When I needed you the most, you turned your back on me. But when Ryan wants a luxury vacation home, you can't throw money at him fast enough. How is that love? My mom's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. For once, I wasn't holding back. Ryan stood up, throwing his napkin on the table. This is ridiculous, he said. I'm not going to sit here and be attacked for something I didn't even do. If you're unhappy with your life, that's on you, not me. He stormed out of the room, leaving an awkward silence in his wake. My dad glared at me, his voice low and furious. You've ruined Christmas, he said. I hope you're happy. I left shortly after that, my heart pounding as I drove home in silence. Part of me regretted the outburst. It wasn't like me to lose my cool like that. But another part of me felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, I'd said what I'd been holding in for years. Still, I knew the fallout would be brutal. My parents weren't the type to let something like this go, and Ryan would milk his victim status for all it was worth. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that this might be the breaking point for my relationship with my family. And while that thought terrified me, it also brought a sense of clarity. For years, I'd bent over backward to maintain the illusion of a happy family, swallowing my feelings and making excuses for their behavior. But now, I couldn't unsee the truth. Things had to change, and if that meant creating some distance, so be it. The aftermath of Christmas dinner was worse than I had anticipated. The morning after, my phone buzzed incessantly with texts from my mom, all variations of the same message. I can't believe you ruined Christmas. We try so hard to make the holidays special, and this is how you repay us? You need to apologize to Ryan. I ignored the messages at first, too emotionally drained to deal with them. But the guilt she was trying to pile onto me seeped in, like it always did. By the afternoon, I finally caved and called her, bracing myself for what I knew would be an unpleasant conversation. Do you have any idea how much you embarrassed us last night? She started before I could even say hello. Embarrassed you? I replied, incredulous. I'm sorry, but am I not allowed to express my feelings? You've been bending over backward for Ryan while acting like I don't exist, and I'm the one who should be embarrassed. You made everything about you, she snapped. It was Christmas, for God's sake. Couldn't you have picked a different time to air your grievances? That became the theme of every conversation I had with my parents in the following weeks. They weren't upset about the favoritism or even willing to address it. They were furious that I had ruined a carefully curated holiday image. My dad called a few days later, and his words stung more than I'd expected. We don't owe you anything, he said bluntly. You're an adult. Maybe if you stopped dwelling on the past, you'd see how much we've done for you. Done for me? I echoed, disbelief clear in my voice. Dad, you wouldn't even lend me money to cover rent when I was on the verge of losing my home. What exactly have you done for me lately? We've always been there for you. He shot back, his tone defensive. Maybe not in the way you wanted, but you've never gone without. I could only laugh bitterly. You mean because I've worked my butt off to make sure I didn't? You've been there for Ryan, not me. But sure, keep telling yourself otherwise. The conversation ended in a stalemate, with my dad accusing me of being ungrateful and me hanging up before I said something I couldn't take back. Ryan, of course, played the victim perfectly. He posted a vague status on social media the day after Christmas. Something about how jealousy is the thief of joy, which immediately prompted a flood of supportive comments from friends and family. You don't deserve that negativity, one comment read. You've worked so hard, and it shows. Every time I opened my phone, it was like a fresh wound being poked. I wanted to scream, to tell everyone that Ryan hadn't worked for a single thing he had. But what was the point? They wouldn't believe me. My parents had done an excellent job crafting an image of Ryan as the hard-working, golden child, and I was just a bitter sibling who couldn't let go of the past. Even among my extended family, the divide became clear. Some relatives subtly distanced themselves from me, while others reached out with cautious words of support. My aunt called one evening, her voice low and conspiratorial. I heard about what happened at Christmas, she said. I just want you to know, you're not wrong. Your parents have always had a blind spot when it comes to Ryan. But you know how they are? They're never going to admit it. Her words were validating, but they didn't make me feel any better. If anything, they only solidified the reality I'd been trying to avoid. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a one-off incident. This was the dynamic in my family, and it wasn't going to change. As the weeks went by, I started pulling away more and more. Every time I spoke to my parents, the conversations were laced with tension and unspoken resentment. My mom still tried to guilt-trip me, reminding me of all the ways she believed they'd been good to me, while my dad dismissed any attempt I made to explain how I felt. You're making yourself miserable by holding on to this, he said during one particularly frustrating call. Life isn't fair. You need to move on. Funny how life isn't fair only seems to apply to me. I replied before ending the call. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to bridge the gap between us. I didn't call as often, skipped family gatherings, and avoided one-on-one interactions whenever possible. The more distance I put between myself and my parents, the clearer things became. They weren't interested in understanding my perspective. To them, Ryan was the success story, and I was the one who just couldn't get it together. It didn't matter how hard I worked or how much I accomplished. Nothing I did would ever measure up to him in their eyes. The realization was both heartbreaking and freeing. I couldn't change how they saw me, but I could change how much of their judgment I allowed to affect me. Slowly, I started shifting my focus to the people who truly supported me, friends, coworkers, and the small circle of extended family who actually listened when I spoke. The fallout from that Christmas dinner marked a turning point in my relationship with my parents. The cracks that had been forming for years finally broke wide open, and there was no way to piece things back together. The months following the Christmas blow-up were like walking a tightrope. Every interaction with my parents was fraught with tension. Every call a delicate balancing act between keeping the peace and swallowing my resentment. It didn't matter how much I tried to focus on my own life or tell myself their opinion didn't matter. Every time I heard my mom gush about Ryan's vacation house or my dad mention how proud they were of him, it reopened the wounds. The strain began to take a toll on me. I found myself replaying conversations in my head long after they were over, stewing over every dismissive comment and unfair comparison. I knew it wasn't healthy, but I couldn't seem to stop. The weight of their favoritism hung over me like a storm cloud, affecting everything from my mood to my relationships. One day, after yet another frustrating call with my mom, where she casually mentioned Ryan's latest hard work project, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. Their dynamic wasn't going to change. No matter how much I tried to explain my feelings or hoped they'd see my side, they remained stubbornly rooted in their ways. If I wanted peace, I'd have to create it myself, even if that meant stepping back. The decision didn't come easily. For all their flaws, my parents were still my family, and cutting back on contact felt like admitting defeat. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that maintaining this toxic relationship wasn't worth the toll it was taking on my mental health. I started small. I stopped calling them every week, letting weeks turn into months without reaching out. When my mom called, I kept the conversation short, steering away from topics that I knew would lead to conflict. I declined invitations to family dinners, offering polite but vague excuses. At first, they didn't seem to notice. My mom, always preoccupied with her own world, probably thought I was just busy. My dad, true to form, didn't press for explanations. But after a few months of missed calls and skipped gatherings, my mom finally confronted me. "Why have you been so distant lately?" she asked during one of her rare visits to my place. She looked genuinely puzzled, as if the months of tension and arguments had never happened. I took a deep breath, knowing this was my chance to be honest. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine," I said. "The way you've treated me compared to Ryan, it hurts, Mom, and I need some space to heal from that." Her reaction was immediate and defensive. "You're being dramatic," she said, crossing her arms. "We've always treated you and Ryan equally. If you feel otherwise, that's on you, not us." I felt a surge of frustration, but forced myself to stay calm. "Mom, that's not true, and you know it. You've prioritized Ryan over me for years. The vacation house, the car, the constant praise, you've always made it clear who your favorite is. I'm not saying this to blame you, but I need you to understand how it feels." She shook her head, her expression a mixture of disbelief and exasperation. "Family is family," she said firmly. "We've done so much for you, and this is how you repay us? By pushing us away." "I'm not pushing you away," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm setting boundaries. I love you, but I can't keep putting myself in situations that make me feel less than. If that means taking a step back for a while, then that's what I need to do." Her eyes filled with tears, but instead of softening, her tone became sharper. "You're going to regret this one day," she said. "When we're gone, you'll wish you'd spent more time with us." The guilt hit me like a wave, but I stood my ground. "Maybe," I said quietly. "But I also know that if I keep letting this dynamic hurt me, I'll regret not standing up for myself. I need this, Mom. I hope you can understand that someday." After she left, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Part of me hoped that conversation would be a wake-up call for her, that she'd finally see the hurt she and my dad had caused and try to make amends. But deep down, I knew better. My parents weren't the type to admit fault, let alone change their behavior. The weeks that followed were both freeing and bittersweet. With the distance, I found myself feeling lighter, less weighed down by their opinions and expectations. But there were moments, birthdays, holidays, and quiet Sunday mornings, when the absence of family stung. I missed the idea of them, the version of my parents I'd always wished they could be. I poured my energy into my job, my friendships, and my hobbies, slowly building a life that felt fulfilling on its own terms. For the first time in years, I started to feel like I was in control of my own happiness, rather than waiting for validation from people who would never give it. My mom continued to call occasionally, usually to remind me of what I was missing out on by distancing myself. Each call felt like a small test, a chance for me to fall back into old patterns. But I stayed firm, reminding myself why I'd made this decision in the first place. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. For the first time in my life, I was choosing myself over their expectations, and that choice felt like a victory. The first thing I noticed after creating distance from my parents was how much lighter I felt. Without the constant tension of their judgment and favoritism weighing me down, I had more energy to focus on the people who genuinely supported me. Friends who had stuck by me during the toughest moments of my divorce became an even bigger part of my life. We started meeting up more often, dinners, weekend hikes, even spontaneous road trips that reminded me of what real connection felt like. Work also became a welcome refuge. Without the emotional drain of family drama, I found myself thriving in my job. I took on new projects, impressed my boss, and eventually landed a promotion. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something meaningful, something that was entirely mine. And then there was my new partner, Liam. We'd met through mutual friends, and while I was cautious at first, his kindness and unwavering support slowly broke down the walls I'd built around myself. Liam didn't just listen when I vented about my family. He validated my feelings, reminding me that I wasn't overreacting or being unreasonable. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly seen. Around this time, I decided to start therapy. It wasn't an easy decision. Admitting I needed help felt like a weakness at first, but it turned out to be one of the best choices I ever made. My therapist, a warm and empathetic woman named Claire, helped me unpack the years of hurt and resentment I'd been carrying. Setting boundaries isn't about punishment, Claire said during one session, after I told her about my decision to distance myself from my parents. It's about protecting yourself. You can love your family and still choose not to let their behavior hurt you. Her words resonated deeply. For so long, I'd felt guilty about pulling away from my parents, as if I were betraying some unspoken rule about family loyalty. But Claire helped me see that choosing myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Through therapy, I also started to confront the deeper wounds my parents had left. The constant comparisons to Ryan, the dismissiveness of my struggles, the way they turned their back on me when I needed them most, it had all shaped the way I saw myself. But for the first time, I began to separate their opinions from my own self-worth. Meanwhile, I threw myself into building a life I could be proud of. I worked hard at my job, not for anyone else's approval, but for my own satisfaction. The promotion I'd earned allowed me to start saving for a house, something I'd once thought was out of reach. Every time I added a little more to my savings account, I felt a surge of pride, knowing I was building something entirely on my own. I also started exploring hobbies I'd long neglected. I took up painting, a passion I'd abandoned years ago, and even joined a local art class. There was something therapeutic about creating something from scratch, about putting my emotions onto a canvas in a way that words couldn't capture. Through all of this, Liam was by my side, cheering me on. When I showed him my first finished painting, he framed it and hung it in his living room, saying, "This deserves to be seen." His belief in me was like a balm for the wounds my family had left, and I began to see myself through his eyes, strong, capable, and worthy of love. The distance from my parents didn't erase the pain entirely. There were still moments when I missed them, when I longed for the kind of relationship I'd always wished we could have. But those moments grew fewer and farther between as I poured my energy into the relationships that truly mattered. Over time, I realized that the life I was building was one I could be proud of, not because it met anyone else's expectations, but because it made me happy. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. For the first time, I felt like I was in control of my own story. And that realization was worth more than any validation my parents could have given me. 3 years have passed since that fateful Christmas, and life looks completely different now. I've built a world for myself that feels fulfilling and grounded. A world where my happiness isn't contingent on seeking approval from people who were never willing to give it. My relationship with my parents is still there, but it's more like a faint echo of what it used to be. We talk occasionally, usually about surface-level things like the weather or updates on extended family. They still ask why I don't visit as often, and each time, I give them the same honest answer. I don't feel like a priority in this family. The first time I said it, my mom froze, caught off guard by my bluntness. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice defensive. I kept my tone even, careful not to let my emotions bleed into my words. "Mom, I tried to explain this before. You've always treated Ryan differently, and it's hurt me more than I think you realize. I'm not angry anymore, but I can't keep pretending it doesn't matter. It's why I've needed space." She didn't argue. Not really. She just sighed and changed the subject, as if avoiding the truth would make it less real. And that's when I realized I'd been waiting for years for an apology, for some acknowledgement of the hurt they'd caused. But that moment wasn't coming, and I had to make peace with that. As for Ryan, our relationship has faded into the background. We exchange polite nods at the rare family gatherings I do attend, but that's the extent of it. He's still the golden boy in my parents' eyes, and I've stopped trying to compete for a title I never wanted. Do I resent him? Not anymore. Therapy helped me see that Ryan isn't the root of the problem. It's the dynamic my parents created, the roles they assigned us that we never asked for. I've learned to let go of the anger I used to carry toward him, not for his sake, but for mine. The distance between us feels natural now. We're different people living different lives, and that's okay. I don't need to be close to him to feel whole, just like I don't need my parents' approval to validate my worth. What matters is the life I've built for myself, the career I've worked hard for, the friends who feel more like family, and the love I've found with Liam. Every time I look at the house I was finally able to buy, the art I've created, or the laughter shared with the people who truly support me, I feel a deep sense of pride. Sometimes when I think back to those painful years, I feel a pang of sadness, not for what I lost, but for what could have been. It's hard not to wonder what my relationship with my parents might look like if things had been different, if they had made me feel as valued as they did Ryan. But those thoughts don't linger the way they used to. I've accepted that some questions will never have answers, and that's okay. Life isn't about waiting for the people who hurt you to make things right. It's about learning to heal and move forward on your own terms. Looking back, I don't regret creating distance between me and my parents. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the right one. Sometimes, choosing yourself means walking away from the people who are supposed to love you the most. Now, when I think about family, I don't just think about the people I was born into, it's also the people I've chosen. The friends who've stood by me, the partner who loves me unconditionally, and the community I've built through my work and passions. For the first time, I feel at peace. Not because everything is perfect, but because I've stopped chasing something I was never going to find. And honestly, that feels like the greatest accomplishment of all.